Welcome to the Hall of Heroes, the world's first and foremost museum dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about protagonists in anime. We've got them all, no matter how big and no matter how small, because regardless of the story, protagonists are the single most important thing that an author needs to nail if they want to be successful. These characters pull in the audience with their journey, their challenges, and their growth, and it doesn't hurt that they can be extremely exciting and entertaining as well. As an audience, we root for, empathize with, and often aspire to be like these characters, but not all protagonists are cut from the same cloth. And that's where our exhibit comes into play. I will be walking you through all 13 types of protagonists, what they do well, and where they fall short. A great protagonist is typically written by someone who understands the strengths and weaknesses of that style of character. For example, look at someone like Edward Elric from Fullmetal Alchemist. This story is 2 decades old, but because Ed is such a fantastic lead who strikes a great balance of prodigy and tragedy, he and his story have stood the test of time. On the other hand, we might have someone like Deku from My Hero Academia. This anime took the world by storm, only to fall off and find itself almost hated by its fanbase. And sure, that is for plenty of reasons, but I would argue a big part of that is because the protagonist lost his connection to the roots of the story. Deku starts out without any abilities, he is quirkless, but through strength of character, he earns a chance to be a hero. However, even when he is given this golden opportunity, he still struggles and nearly kills himself using his new powers. It's a very compelling story that is kneecapped as we learn about lineage factors and the hidden quirks within Deku's quirks. Homie went from underdog to just under god, and the story feels kind of disconnected because of that. A character needs to know their lane and become a master of it. And if they are trying to become something else as the story progresses, that transition needs to be handled very carefully. It's this kind of disconnect that causes a character to fall from grace and leads a series to go from being overwhelmingly loved to falling apart at the seams. But even before deciding the type of protagonist that an author wants to work with, they need to decide on the amount of protagonists. And that leads us to our first showcase. While it is pretty typical for a series to follow just one main character, some anime, like Assassination Classroom, can have multiple protagonists. In fact, this story has an entire classroom full of them. And as a result, we have a series where almost every character acts as a protagonist at different points in the story. Now, why would you want a series with so many different perspectives? Well, by making a wider focus like this, the story can really work on ideas of collective growth and empathy as the characters open up to one another and become better together. Then there are series like Baccano, in this case being a story told out of order with no real defined lead. This can add flexibility to the pacing and create suspense within an almost puzzle-like world that the audience pieces together. But once we know if we are dealing with one, multiple, or even no protagonists, we can move on to the next exhibit where we will ask the big question, are we the good guys or the baddies? Now take a look at the moral heroes. There's often an association between the protagonist and the good guys, but that isn't always the case. While typically you do have a lead character like Tanjiro in Demon Slayer, who has all the moral goodness of a newborn puppy, sometimes we can also have morally neutral characters like Guts from Berserk. We can even have anime where the villains are our eyes to the world, like in Death Note. By presenting a different moral system for the lead character to play with, and not only defaulting to the story of the good guy, you can completely shift the tone and message of the series. The morality of heroes shapes not only the character themselves, but also the trajectory of the story. Morally complex characters can add layers of depth, intrigue, and philosophical exploration that make audiences consider the meaning of right and wrong. The moral compass of a protagonist is not just a character trait, but a tool that influences the themes, conflicts, and resolutions of the narrative. For example, the good guy, like Tanjiro Kamado. This is the most common and consistent anime main character archetype. It is the quintessential hero, epitomizing courage, compassion, and unwavering goodness. Tanjiro is honestly the perfect example of this archetype. He has steadfast dedication to protecting others and always upholds righteous values. But honestly, he might overcommit to this. Despite facing unimaginable hardships and genuinely terrifying or horrifying villains, he almost always retains his empathy and kindness, and ultimately strives to protect both humanity and the souls of the demons he comes across. And we get a perfect example of this almost immediately in the story during the final selection test, where Tanjiro comes across the Hand Demon, who has killed generations of Urokodaki's students and nearly killed Tanjiro himself. However, he still takes a moment to empathize with the demon as it dies. Tanjiro is able to sense the child led astray within that monster and begins to hold his hand as he fades into the afterlife so that he won't have to be alone in his last moments. It's one thing to be a good person who does the right thing for people that they care about, or even for the sake of the greater good. However, Tanjiro tends to take the extra step and even extends his goodness to those who try to kill him. He is always able to see the good inside of a person, and we'll see that again with Susumaru, the Spider Mother, Daki, Gyutaro, and even Akaza. In contrast, when it comes to demons like Muzan or Hantengu, who were always bastards, Tanjiro doesn't extend that same understanding because, unlike the other demons, they were not people turned into monsters, they were always monsters, even when they were humans. What I love about Tanjiro's portrayal of goodness is that while it can come across as naive, he never lets it cloud his judgment. Being good and being kind does not stop him from killing demons who are a danger to the world around them. Instead, it just allows him, and by extension the audience, to sympathize for the person these demons used to be. And it's why we love so many of the villains in Demon Slayer. He shows moral clarity and altruism in a world that is quite literally infested with bloodthirsty monsters, but by keeping that positive yet honest perspective, he serves as a beacon of hope in an otherwise very pessimistic story. That said, the failure of this archetype is that these characters often get labeled as goody two-shoes or uninteresting, and it's a very fine line to walk, but I think that Tanjiro does this well overall. But of course, there's definitely people who don't feel the same way. Even in saying that though, the fact of the matter is that Tanjiro will never act in a way that surprises you. He is a safe character in that way, and he will always do what is good, which can lead to him feeling predictable or even tedious at times. And it's for that exact reason that the most popular types of protagonists tend to be those with a bit of grit and flavor to their morality, which leads us to the next type of moral hero, the anti-hero. In stark contrast to the traditionally good hero, anti-heroes tend to be morally gray. They challenge conventional notions of righteousness and justice. These characters aren't locked into classical heroic traits like courage, selflessness, or even honor, and instead they might be more cynical or willing to resolve to violence, lying, and cheating. Because of this, anti-heroes are often considered to be more realistic portrayals of humanity. The fact of the matter is, no one is as kind or good as Tanjiro. People have flaws, people have edges, and those factors can add the complexity and contradictions that define the human condition to a story. A solid example of an anti-hero in action is Guts from Berserk. His story is marred by violence and tragedy, and as a result, his quest for survival and revenge often has him acting in cold and brutal ways. He is more than willing to sacrifice just about anything to achieve his goal and reach Griffith. The most extreme example definitely comes in the Black Swordsman arc though, in which we see a complete disregard for human life, and many times he's even excited to see others die. In this arc, Guts ridicules those who aren't strong and explains that he wants to crush them because they are weak. And we see proof of that when Guts tortures the Count in front of his innocent daughter, completely disregarding how fucked up it is, just because neither of them have the power to stop him. But at the same time, Guts is a character who grows into someone who devotes himself to heroic goals. He never wants to lose Casca. He encourages and supports his friends, and he protects the innocent whenever he can. He is interesting because we get to experience nearly the entire spectrum of what it means to be an anti-hero. We see him going from near villainous to near altruistic depending on where we look in the story, and that's such an interesting range for a character to portray. But what makes him such a good example of an anti-hero is that he embodies the mentality of following his own moral code regardless of the situation. Now, that code might change and evolve over time, but that is the complexity and depth that many people often feel is missing with wholly good characters like Tanjiro. In real life, we grow, our understanding of the world around us changes. What we think is right or wrong today, we might not consider to be so tomorrow. But characters like Tanjiro, who never need to adjust their worldview and instead only do what is good, will never show that level of development. And in this way, anti-heroes offer a chance to subvert expectations of protagonists. They can explore ethics or morality in a more meaningful way and challenge the audience by forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about humanity. The characters themselves are inherently flawed and often broken, giving them a chance to grow and heal in a way that we can latch onto, connect with, and even be inspired by. But of course, while good protagonists are the most common and the anti-hero is the most popular, there also exists a third category which has an entirely different purpose, and that is the villain protagonist. Now, this is probably my favorite moral avenue for a protagonist to have, maybe because it's the rarest and least explored, at least in Japanese media. It's very common in Western series, especially in the early 2000s and 2010s. But if an anti-hero is a character meant to grow and develop, then villainous protagonists are often those we can watch morally degrade or decay. And when we're talking about characters like this in anime, there's really only a few that people jump to immediately, those being Eren from Attack on Titan and Light from Death Note. And these stories giving us the perspective of the villain can act to warp the audience's understanding of right and wrong in a way that heroic heroes and anti-heroes just can't do. Now, before I get another 100 comments about how Light isn't a villain, like I did in my villain series, real quick, you're dumb and you're wrong.
You're not just wrong, you're stupid. And you're ugly, just like your mum.
He just is a villain, so sit down. Just because a character is the protagonist does not mean they are the good guy. A protagonist is simply the central character of the story. That's it. There's no sense of good or evil associated with the word. However, most stories are told from the perspective of the good guy. I mean, it's kind of the default that we follow the hero on their journey to defeat the villain, and that's where the mix-up comes from. But just because that's the norm doesn't mean that we can't follow a story where the villain is the central figure. And in the case of Light, he is a megalomaniacal serial killer with a god complex who takes advantage of and manipulates everyone that he can to achieve his goals and in the pursuit of his own survival. Like, yeah, he's a fucking villain, my dudes. What part of that sounds heroic? What Light does really effectively, though, is that he sells that what he is doing is justice. Light tells himself and the audience that he is doing the right thing by eliminating criminals. It's all for the greater good, right? It's a morally complex argument, like, is it okay to kill someone who's about to kill someone else? And where do we draw that line? For Light, it's not a hard question, it's black and white. Any violent criminal should be wiped out, and their death will deter others from acts of violence in the future. And you know what? Kinda fucked up, but it works. Throughout the series, Light kills nearly 125,000 people. But along with those murders is a noticeable drop in global crime rates. And now we have the question, are 100,000 lives a fair trade for peace? And I don't know. That's a question for you, your god, and Hiroshima to answer. But that whole argument becomes twisted almost immediately. Once the FBI and L start looking for him, Light goes on the defensive. He's not just taking the lives of criminals, he's taking the lives of anyone who gets in his way. And he says he is justice, so anyone opposing him must be acting unjustly. But the more innocent people that he kills, the more intense the search for him becomes. And that leads to even more erratic killings, which creates a kind of feedback loop. But that's the thing, depending on whether or not you agree with Light, the entire story has a different message and meaning. You will never find this kind of moral dilemma in a series like Demon Slayer. Hell, Tanjiro never even had to struggle with the idea of meeting a bad person. He only had to fight against demons. But that's not a knock against Demon Slayer, it's just a different style of story, and that's okay. But while classic heroes don't really relate to villains that well, anti-heroes kind of do. In each case, you are dealing with moral ambiguity and challenging societal or ethical norms. However, the character arcs for these protagonists tend to be opposites. While anti-heroes will start as cold and indifferent people who grow towards being more positive characters and often find value in others or in romance to expand the tiny circles they've made for themselves, villainous protagonists often become worse over time. We see them lose themselves to obsession or fear as they spiral out of control. If you were to place all three of these characters in the exact same situation, each of them would react differently, and as a result, the progression of their story would all branch out into different avenues as well, and I think that's such a cool function of storytelling to work with. By delving into the moral values of anime protagonists, audiences are invited to confront their own beliefs and their perceptions of what is right and wrong, and that's why the morality of these heroes is such an important factor to acknowledge. Now, if moral heroes stand to give the audience something to think about, the ethics of any given situation, then tragic heroes give us something to feel. Believe it or not, this term goes all the way back to Aristotle, who defined tragic heroes as people who undergo an experience that evokes the emotion of fear and pity in the audience, as those were fundamental to creating catharsis. Basically, if the audience can be made to worry about and for a character, then they will also be able to share in their triumphs and defeats going forward. And with that in mind, at the heart of every tragic hero is a blend of virtues and flaws that define that character. They're often depicted as noble and virtuous, possessing admirable qualities like courage, intelligence, and determination, but along with all those good things is what the Greeks called hamartia, the fatal flaw of a character that leads to their downfall. This could be hubris, pride, blinding ambition, or even just poor judgment. Despite their best intentions and noble aspirations, a tragic hero's journey is ultimately filled with sorrow, suffering, and death. Now, you might be asking, why the hell would you want to watch a story that is depressing like that? And as Aristotle said, for catharsis. The tragic hero's struggle resonates with the audience on a visceral level, inviting them to confront their own fears, doubts, and vulnerabilities. Through empathizing with a tragic hero's story, viewers might find comfort, insight, or even a renewed appreciation for the fleeting beauty of life. In anime, we tend to see tragic heroes in two different camps. Firstly, our characters looking for redemption. Ruroni Kenshin, for example, is a story of, well, a Ruroni named Kenshin. Damn, these scripts basically write themselves. On the surface, Ken might be the happiest and most carefree character that I've ever seen in an anime. He takes joy from the most simple and seemingly insignificant things. He faces any moment with complete optimism and integrity. Even the way he talks is meant to make him seem innocent and endearing. I mean, let's look at the scene where he meets Yahiko. This kid is trying to rob him, Ken catches him in the act, but then he just shrugs it off and says,
"It's alright. If I get my pocket picked, I deserve it."
Only to give the wallet back to the kid and tell him that he shouldn't get caught next time. This dude is a saint, but of course that is just one side of him. This is Kenshin Himura and not Hitokiri Batosai, the man he used to be. You see, Kenshin wasn't always this lovable dope. During the Boshin War, Kenshin was known as the Batosai, the most ruthless and feared swordsman of the era. The reason that Kenshin changed his name, took up a life of peace, and keeps up his cheery disposition is that he is crushed by the guilt from the overwhelming amount of blood on his hands. No matter how much good Kenshin is able to do through the series, he is constantly bombarded by the weight of his past, and he struggles to believe himself worthy of forgiveness. And this obviously comes into conflict as we meet terrible people who need to be killed, like Enishi and Shishio. As he comes across these monsters, Kenshin is given the dilemma to either allow them to go on and kill hundreds of people themselves, or to break his own vow to never kill and prove that he hasn't changed since the Boshin War. It's almost the inverse of what we talked about with Light Yagami. While Light was looking for an excuse to kill, and to absolve himself of any wrongdoing, Kenshin is so racked by guilt that he is desperately trying to find reasons not to kill. It's a mindset that really pulls in the audience. When he fights Shishio, we want him to find the resolve to kill his opponent just as much as we are saddened by the idea of him being forced to bloody his hands again. This conflict is what brings excitement and suspense into the story that you can only really find because Ken is such a tragic figure. But while Ken's story as a tragic hero was one working towards redemption, we can look at the Ancient Magus Bride, where we meet Chise Hatori, and see that another way to deal with tragic heroes is to have them move beyond their own tragedy. At the beginning of the story, Chise is someone completely broken and filled with despair. As a child, she had been haunted by spirits called Fae and neighbors, and her parents needed to protect her constantly. However, ultimately neither of them could deal with the stress associated with this. Originally, her father was the one to fight off the creatures, but over time, they wore him down, and he eventually felt the need to walk out on his wife and daughter. With him gone, Chise's mother Chika had to protect her, but again, the neighbors gave her so much stress that she has a mental break. First, she tries to kill Chise, and then realizing what she was doing, she kills herself right in front of Chise. Now, understandably, this kinda messes Chise up. She believes that she scared off, corrupted, and destroyed her family because the neighbors and the Fae were coming for her. And while she's dealing with all the trauma from being left behind, she is still being plagued by neighbors to this day. She feels like a black hole that takes in and eliminates all the good around her, and because of that, she believes that her life has no value. And this brings us to the beginning of the first episode, where Chise hates herself so much that she actually tries to sell herself into slavery. Unbeknownst to her, though, she was bought by a man named Elias, who wasn't looking for a slave, but instead was trying to find an apprentice to teach magic to, while they could teach him about what it means to have human emotions. Through her studies under Elias, Chise discovers a sense of belonging and acceptance as she learns to harness her magic and confront her inner demons. For the first time, she doesn't need to be protected, she isn't going to be abandoned, and she can work on discovering her self-worth rather than wallowing in self-hatred. Tragic heroes like Kenshin and Chise remind viewers that everyone has value regardless of what they've lived through, and that everyone can find love and acceptance. They don't show that this journey is going to be something easy, and instead they guide the audience by telling them, hey, this journey has to start with yourself. These characters have gone through hell, and realistically probably worse lives than most of us will have. And if they can work towards self-acceptance and compassion, then I'm sure we can too. But while tragic heroes evoke empathy and reflection on their journeys, the next exhibit is about characters who hold on to cynicism probably much more than they should. These are Byronic heroes. It's probably the most popular archetype of character in both anime and Western media. These are your Jack Sparrows, your Han Solos, your Sherlocks, and your Iron Mans. While the title Byronic might seem a bit silly or weird, it is definitely a type of character that we all know. The name itself comes from an early 19th century English poet called Lord Byron, and he was the one to popularize this character archetype by apparently writing characters who reflected himself. Basically, he self-inserted so hard that he created a whole genre of character. But what does a Byronic hero entail? Well, they are brooding, rebellious, and they are morally ambiguous. They tend to be charismatic outsiders who oppose establishment and reject convention. They share a lot of common traits that we usually see in anti-heroes, however, Byronic heroes differ in a few ways. While anti-heroes tend to be overall altruistic despite their methods, Byronic heroes are often more motivated by self-interest and inner turmoil. They will act out against the powers that be because it demonstrates their own individuality and autonomy more so than opposing them because it's the right thing to do. Anime's most famous Byronic hero is probably Lelouch from Code Geass. Like Light, Lelouch has the ultimate goal of achieving justice. However, rather than presenting himself as a god dealing out that justice, Lelouch is trying to inspire a revolution to change the entire social order in order to reach that goal instead. Rather than sentencing people to death, Lelouch changes the way that people live. And while he does have the power of the Geass to force people to comply, his real power is his charisma and the genuine hope that he offers for those people around him. On the surface, Lelouch is marked by confidence and intelligence. But at the same time, he struggles with the trauma from the death of his mother and the crippling of his sister. It was this attack on his family that ends up motivating Lelouch to try and destroy Britannia. So, while to everyone else he appears to be some genius strategist aiming for the betterment of his nation, Lelouch is not really concerned with the morality of things and is instead being guided by a self-interested quest for vengeance. a vengeance which brings about the sense of rebellion and opposition to authority that Byronic heroes are emblematic of. But along with this idea of difficult experiences, we also have survivor protagonists. These are characters who have endured significant hardships, traumas, or adversity, and emerged stronger as a result. They are symbols of resilience, determination, and a strong will to overcome the challenges that they face. While anime is full of characters who struggle to persevere through horrible circumstances, I think the perfect moment to encapsulate what a survivor character is can be seen in Black Clover. In general, Asta's whole thing is tenacity and hard work, but there's one scene that I think really represents who he is as a character. For context, if you haven't seen the show, Black Clover is this world filled with magic, but our protagonist, Asta, can't use any of it. And primarily he fights with big-ass swords. It's pretty cool, but it becomes an issue after his arms get cursed, and he's told that he will likely never be able to use them again. And that's a bit of a big deal if you're a sword boy. Now, one of his guildmates, Finral, overhears the doctor telling him this and explains what's happening to the rest of the Black Bulls, and they all start talking about how unfair it is that this kid born without magic now can't even use his weapons. They are horrified by the idea of watching in real time as his dreams are shattered. Together, they end up looking for Asta and try to console him, but when they find him, he's alone on a small cliff just staring up at the moon. He's trembling, it seems like he's on the verge of tears. And then the strangest thing happens. As they watch helplessly expecting their squadmate to break down, Asta shouts at the sky, cursing at fate for trying to mess with him one more time, adding in that if anything, he is more fired up and vows that he will either find a way to fix his arms or find a new way to fight and stand up for what he believes in. Like I said, there are hundreds of examples of survivor protagonists in anime, but I think it's safe to say that Asta's unstoppable hopefulness is the epitome of this trope. What's really important here, though, is that he is struggling with this reality. As boisterous and confident as he is trying to come across, he's just about ready to fall apart. However, rather than letting himself fall victim to that very justifiable sadness that he's feeling, he instead turns that into motivation to push forward. But it doesn't feel like that generic pull yourself up by your bootstraps or just don't be sad forehead mentality. It feels genuine. Because of how earnest Asta is as a character, it doesn't come across as insincere, and instead it becomes a true triumph of spirit that the audience is able to latch on to. Now, from survivor to survivalist, these protagonists aren't so much about moving beyond their struggles as they are currently going through them. Survivalists are resourceful characters and make the most of their surroundings to overcome any challenge that might meet them in their quest for survival. This could present itself on an intellectual basis like we had with Light and L trying to evade and outwit each other. Or it could be a more classic way like a man versus wilderness setting, which you might see in something like Princess Mononoke. However, if we're going to be talking about anime here, we gotta use a death game as an example because, I mean, that's the most anime thing, right? Future Diary is a series in which 12 players are chosen to participate in a battle royale, each of which is given the mission to be the last man standing, as well as diaries which can tell the future to give them a leg up. Our protagonist is Yukiteru Amano, an unassuming kid who needs to make the most of the predictions given to him in order to avoid his would-be assassins, and more importantly to keep a particularly crazy pink-haired girl from going full yandere on him. Now, in general, Yuki is a very timid dude, with all the backbone that you might expect to find in a worm. However, as it turns out, when your options are learn to stand up for yourself and fight back, or die a brutal and painful death, even the most cowardly character can grow and develop into something greater than he ever was. The real pitfall of this archetype, though, is the ass pull. We want and need these characters to feel talented and grounded in reality, even if it's a supernatural series. If Yuki is going to outwit his opponents, it has to feel real and earned, and if it doesn't, then the whole credibility of the story just falls apart. Like, his diary can't just read, tomorrow at 3 o'clock, 5 other players are going to be taking a nap on train tracks. You can pull this lever to kill them. There needs to be a real and tangible threat that is dealt with in a meaningful way for a survivalist to feel satisfying. Now, for our next exhibit, we have arguably the most iconic of anime protagonist types, for better or for worse, and that is the Chosen One. These characters are defined by their special destinies, innate talents, or unique abilities. They have a singular mission or a quest that will shape the fate of their world, whether they're destined to defeat an ancient evil, to bring balance to the universe, or to fulfill some prophecy that will lead to peace. While this archetype can be a little tiring, especially if the lead is something of a Mary Sue, it also provides quite a few benefits. Namely, chosen ones carry with them a sense of purpose and direction that gives the story urgency and significance, which can keep viewers engaged. Additionally, the chosen one allows us to explore themes of destiny, identity, and personal growth as the protagonist grapples with the weight of their responsibilities and needs to confront the expectations that are placed upon them. Chosen ones offer escapism and wish fulfillment for the audience, and can draw us into stories of ordinary individuals who are thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The idea of being chosen for a special destiny or possessing a unique ability allows viewers to vicariously experience the thrill of adventure through protagonists' journeys. However, on the other hand, it can sometimes feel formulaic and predictable, leading to cliches and tropes that are overused or derivative. On top of that, when our lead is a chosen one, the supporting cast can sometimes get completely overshadowed. But in general, this category is split into two parts: the predestined and the earned chosen ones. When we talk about predestined or predetermined, we might think of someone like Naruto. While he obviously was unassuming as a child and definitely feels like an underdog early on, as the story develops, we find that Naruto has always been destined for greatness. He is the child of the fourth Hokage, the reincarnation of Asura. The burden of the Nine Tails ends up being a nearly endless pool of chakra that he has access to, and hell, there's a literal prophecy that he will change the ninja world. He may have very humble and challenging beginnings, but Naruto was always going to do something special. On the other hand, we have characters who were not chosen by fate, but who become the ones destiny needs them to be. They need to earn their opportunities and then use that to save the world. Looking at My Hero Academia, we can find Deku. Deku was never meant to be the inheritor of One for All. Mirio was. However, when All Might sees this kid impulsively challenging a villain to save someone else, he ultimately decides to change his plans and allows Deku to take his quirk from him. While Naruto's journey is shaped by fate and predetermined circumstances, Deku's journey, at least at the start, is marked by agency and personal growth. Naruto is thrust into his role as a chosen one from birth, but Deku has to carve out his path through hard work, sacrifice, and self-discovery. While Naruto's destiny is written in the stars, Deku's is forged through his actions and his choices. But what's important in both of these cases is that this is simply how these characters get the tools that they need. Naruto was born with his, and Deku needed to earn and be given his, but even then, they need to still put in the work to be ready when destiny calls them. Even if Naruto is the reincarnation of Asura, even if Deku is given One for All, they still need to grow and develop on their own so that when the time comes, they are ready. When it comes to effective chosen one protagonists, having the tools is not enough if you are incapable of using them, and that journey to become ready is why we love this trope so much. Some protagonists are not fighting for the fate of the world though, and just want to change society. The revolutionary protagonist carries with it themes of rebellion, defiance, and social change. They're defined by unwavering commitment to challenging the status quo and opposing oppressive systems of power. These characters inspire viewers with their courage, conviction, and determination as they fight for a better world, and at their best, they can serve as a catalyst for exploring complex social, political, or philosophical themes. That said, at their worst, they can feel heavy-handed and like the author's trying to beat you over the head with some kind of ideology. One of my personal favorite revolutionary characters is Ryuko Matoi from Kill la Kill. While at first she's on this quest to avenge her father, she quickly finds herself challenging the entirety of Honoji Academy and its tyrannical leader, Satsuki. As we dive further into the story though, it's discovered that the super-powered life fiber uniforms that students in the school are wearing are part of a greater plot towards world domination, and as such, we see Ryuko joining the rebel group, Nudist Beach, and taking up arms against Satsuki's mother Ragyo. Kill la Kill, at its core, is a commentary on how an over-obsession with material goods and vanity, for example a fixation on clothing, can corrupt a society and lead humanity into becoming mindless puppets working towards owning fancy things. However, while that message is literally always present within the show, it never really feels heavy-handed or forced. There's no moment where Ryuko turns to the camera and says, "And that's why we should lead more minimalist lives and focus less on material goods." Instead, it's up to the viewer to understand that simple message and apply it to the rest of the series. On top of that, Kill la Kill acknowledges that there is a middle path. The primary tool that she is using to rise up against Ragyo is her own life fiber outfit. By incorporating this into the series, the message shifts from being materialism is bad to instead being materialism can be fine, but you can't let it swallow you whole. And a message like that is often going to land a lot better with the audience than saying you should or shouldn't live like this. Now, moving on from characters who are aiming to fix society as a whole, to characters who are more concerned with finding what's missing in their own lives. The quester protagonist is defined by their epic journeys and lofty goals. Questers will embark on adventures that shape their identity, test their limits, and redefine their understanding of the world. In many cases, presenting the message that the journey is much more important than what they were actually looking for all along. In particular, questing characters can really shine in two types of stories. Firstly, character-driven ones where we see them growing with each new encounter they make. As the protagonist meets new people and comes across new perspectives, will their original goal hold its value? Or will it end up taking a backseat to larger issues at hand? And second, they are great in stories where world building takes priority. After all, the whole idea of a quest comes with this concept of traveling to far-off lands, seeing fantastical places, and meeting people who are larger than life. But what type of quest are these characters on? Are they searching for something tangible or intangible? As far as the tangible goes, Edward Elric embarks on a mission to find the Philosopher's Stone and reclaim his brother's missing body. It is a very classic setup, a journey to find some mystical object without even knowing if it's real, all in the hopes of fixing Alphonse. However, along the way, the morality and ethics of this dream are quickly put into question. Firstly, to gain access to the research and resources that they're going to need to find the stone, Ed has to become a state alchemist, a dog of the military that's required to go where he is told and, if necessary, kill whoever he is ordered to kill. On top of that, without giving too much of a spoiler, it turns out Philosopher's Stones are made by some pretty fucked up methods. So is it really okay or even worth it to regain Al's body if it means taking advantage of that kind of tool? But if he doesn't use the stone, will there ever be another way to save him? Ed grapples with the consequences of his actions. He ultimately discovers the true meaning of sacrifice. He works towards redemption, and he seriously needs to question the value of human life along this journey. It's an extremely simple setup that allows for so many questions to pop up along the way, and by asking those questions, the audience becomes more and more engaged with each episode. Of course, not all searches are created equal, and you can have a quest like Natsu's in Fairy Tail. He's looking for his lost father, the dragon Igneal. However, through its entirety, Fairy Tail pays almost no attention to this mission. The idea is more that if Natsu continues to travel the country on guild missions, then maybe he's gonna stumble on information eventually, but it just never happens. And when Igneal does show up, it has literally nothing to do with anything Natsu did. And what's more, he's removed from the story just as suddenly. It takes all the wind out of this event. No effort is put into it, very little comes out of it, and as a result, it kind of falls flat. But on the other hand, you can look at Luffy's mission to save Robin in Enies Lobby. Like Natsu, Luffy is trying to get to someone that was taken away from him. However, rather than making it some mission on the back burner that never gets any attention, this rescue mission has so much effort and care put into it. Each crew member is pushed to their limits, there is intentionality in this mission, and they end up declaring war on the world government in order to prove that she is worth saving. And I think that intentionality and effort goes a long way in adding worth to a quest if you're looking for something tangible. But what if you're not? Let's talk about something intangible in revenge. Edmond Dantes from Gankutsuo, the Count of Monte Cristo, is a man who was framed and falsely imprisoned for years, ultimately selling his soul to a demon so that he could escape and dedicate the rest of his life to picking apart the people who betrayed him. Revenge in this case becomes an absolute obsession, something he must acquire at any expense. And because of this, we can follow as the values and morals of a good man become as corrupted and vile as the terrible ones of the people who locked him up. This anime is actually based on my favorite book, and while the stories differ in quite a few pretty crazy ways, each is meant to leave the audience questioning what is fair and just, and if that even really matters when a person has everything taken from them unjustly. It's questions like these that make those intangible quests so interesting. And even more so, it is the coming to terms with a character's decisions and living with the consequences that make characters like these so great. And Dantes is a perfect example of that. Do you know what else Dantes was, though? Kind of a genius. And that brings us to the next protagonist archetype, the prodigies. These characters have extraordinary ability, intellect, or skills, and earn the admiration or envy of all those around them. Most importantly, though, prodigies fill the audience with wonder. But the best prodigies, though, bring the people around them into their story. They can prop them up to become great themselves, or they can struggle with the expectation and weight of their own greatness from those people. On the other hand, prodigy protagonists almost always feel unrealistic and unrelatable. They aren't characters that the audience can connect with easily, and instead end up being spectacles. We like to look at them, but we can't see ourselves in them, at least usually. A fantastic example of a prodigy is Senku in Dr. Stone. After humanity is flash frozen in rock for nearly 4,000 years, Senku emerges and aims to recreate civilization with science. Now, you and I might like to imagine what we'd do if we were in that kind of situation, but the average person doesn't really know enough about science, medicine, or technology to make an impact. But that isn't the case for Senku. He is the definition of genius, and it isn't specific knowledge either. He's informed on basically everything and anything that you can think of. He creates magnets with lightning, produces a sulfa drug, sets up blast furnaces to produce iron. He makes glass, leather, gas masks, soda, cotton candy, vacuum pumps. From agriculture to electricity to even cell phones and rudimentary cars. He is a one-man encapsulation of everything humanity has learned about the world, and when you watch him, he genuinely feels larger than life. While it is clearly science, he almost feels like a wizard turning basic elements into whatever his nation of science needs. And it can be as impressive to watch him do this as Goku going Super Saiyan sometimes. But at the same time, I generally don't really empathize with Senku. I can't. He's too amazing of a person for me to really understand, and I can't see how he sees the world. And because of that, I end up feeling admiration instead of building a connection, which I might with another protagonist. However, this has a hidden effect as well. While it's rare for Senku to open up or let emotions take over, the small moments where he does hit like a truck. It's a bit of an absence makes the heart grow fonder kind of thing. And since it's such a rare experience, it becomes really powerful. In cases where prodigies become vulnerable or are brought down to human levels, they can become some of the greatest characters that anime has to offer in those moments. The audience is not only amazed by them, but they can also finally connect with them like they've been trying to do for 10, 20, 100 episodes. But that's all in the cases where prodigies rise to the occasion and use their gifts to the best of their ability. What would happen when a prodigy loses their gift? Well, for that we can look at Your Lie in April. In this series, a boy named Kousei begins studying piano as a child and finds out that he has perfect pitch and incredible innate talent. And at the same time, his mother starts to become sick. As her health deteriorates, she begins panicking and worrying about her son's future without her, and so she is led to obsessing over his gift for the piano. If she could just ensure that he becomes something great, then even if she passed away, she could know that he'd be okay. But this kinda backfires. Kousei was sealed away from his friends so that he could practice. It was all he ever did. But he didn't mind. To him, every time he played the piano, it was a chance to make his mother happy, and he believed that if he became good enough, then maybe he could even heal her. But obviously, that isn't how medicine works. She continued to get worse, and so did her anxiety. She yelled at him and beat him publicly for playing what he felt rather than what was written. After all, the judges only care for accuracy, and any emotion or love for piano is irrelevant. When Kousei had been pushed over the edge, he told his mother about how hard he had been trying to save her, but now he just wished that she was dead. It was one of their last conversations before she ended up passing away, and he became so stricken with guilt that his mind shut out music entirely. He couldn't hear the notes that he played anymore, and he gave up the piano forever. This is a fallen prodigy. Someone with all the talent in the world, but through trauma or horrible experiences, loses access to their gift. It's a much more rare portrayal of this archetype, but it definitely is one that is more effective at connecting with the audience. You don't look to Kousei in awe like you do with Senku. You look to him with pity and sadness. And when he meets Kaori and she starts working towards reigniting his love for music, you start rooting for him all the way until he plays that final, beautiful song at the end of the series. But even then, it's not admiration that the audience feels, it's 1,000 other emotions as the story comes to its peak. Because of that, despite Kousei and Senku clearly both being prodigies, their impact to the story could not be more separate. We remember them for entirely different reasons, and while I like Senku more as a protagonist, I think turning the prodigy archetype into a tragic one allowed Kousei to stay with me in a way that Senku just never could. Now, from prodigy protagonists, we are jumping into their polar opposites with underdogs. This is the bread and butter of shonen anime, characters who seem weak and unassuming at the start of the series, but through hard work, determination, and perseverance manage to overcome the obstacles in their way. Underdogs often come from humble beginnings or lack some kind of talent or ability. They stand in the face of insurmountable challenges as they try to achieve their dreams and prove their worth. By this point, we know the name of the protagonist's game is to make them relatable, and underdogs do this better than just about any other group. They have this ability to resonate with the audience on a deep personal level. They come with this sense of satisfaction from watching someone start at the bottom and scratch and claw their way upwards that inspires viewers to find their own potential and resilience. At the same time, though, audiences seem extremely quick to disprove or disavow that a character is an underdog. Naruto, for example, is a character who is framed as an underdog, but people will jump at the chance to bring up the Nine Tails and that he is a reincarnation and his nutso genetics. Giving a character too many aspects which assist in their struggle can leave people feeling really dissatisfied with their journey. However, as I talk about in my Naruto video, I don't really think he was ever meant to be an underdog for the whole story. It was just for a moment in time up until the Chunin exams. And people just force the themes of that early section onto the rest of the story as a whole. But that, as I said, is in the other video if you want to hear more. An actual underdog can be found in Shoyo Hinata in Haikyu. What really makes this character easy to work with is that in sports, there are clear advantages and disadvantages to each body type in each different game. And in this case, a 5'4" short king isn't exactly built for volleyball. Adding on to this that he specifically wants to be a spiker, and you have a very uphill battle. Shoya didn't even have friends to practice with before joining Karasuno, but still we see him training all day every day. If he isn't biking uphill both ways to school like our grandparents used to, then he's working on his stamina, or he's practicing his jumps or spikes or passing. Anytime this kid can have a ball in his hands, he does. And I think there's a lot of reasons that the audience is so able to resonate with him. Firstly, he is incredibly earnest in his love for the game and his desire to be great. It is adorable, it's wholesome, and it's pure. But second, and more importantly, I think that everyone at some point in their life has been told that they can't do something. It could be because of their height, their gender, their intelligence, or anything, right? So seeing someone have the courage to actually go for their dream, to put in 110%, and then be able to find a group of people who love and accept him and welcome him into their world, it's just something magical that can tug on anyone's heartstrings. And that's the beauty of underdog characters. They allow the audience to look back on their past selves and think, damn, I should have stuck with that thing that I really loved. And at the same time, they can cheer on someone else as they endeavor to not make the same mistakes. They are the ultimate example of hope and optimism in the face of adversity, and it's why even when Western stories need to give us a hero, we usually start out with the scrawny Steve Rogers before we end up with something like Captain America. There's just something more boring about a story where the protagonist is and always has been amazing, but to see someone become amazing is really something special. And finally, our last exhibit is the mentor-type protagonists. Mentors are a guiding force and source of wisdom for the people around them. They're defined by their experience, knowledge, and often unconventional methods. One of the primary benefits of a mentor protagonist is that they allow the story to break down life lessons, moral guidance, and philosophical insights in a much more digestible way. Furthermore, mentor protagonists offer a sense of reassurance and stability in the face of uncertainty. But unfortunately, this archetype isn't often the one that we're exploring, as we usually follow someone at the beginning of their journey where they need to be mentored. And that's why series like That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime can be such an interesting or unique experience. This is an isekai where the protagonist, Rimuru Tempest, enters the world as an all-powerful slime who gains the strength and abilities of anything he consumes. Almost immediately he swallows a storm dragon and gains unbelievable strength and influence. And with this new power, he becomes the leader of a small tribe of goblins. Over time, he transforms this gathering of small monsters into a well-defined society that has structure, order, and which is self-sufficient. By giving the goblins names, he raises their power and intelligence, while also guiding them to make responsible and wise choices to assist with the development of their town. Under Rimuru, the goblins would even go on to gain unlikely allies in wolves, dwarves, demons, and many others who were inspired by the perspective and knowledge offered by the slime. And this is where the mentor is most effective. While, for instance, Chosen One characters tend to overshadow the secondary cast, mentor leads will make every character they come in contact with shine. Sure, Rimuru is always going to shine the brightest, but he's not blocking out those around him. He's improving their lives and improving them as people as well. It's a very cool but underutilized archetype, and I'm hoping we get more of it in the future. But that concludes our exhibit covering the 13 types of protagonists in anime. If you could just fill out the survey in the comments by telling me which type of protagonist you like the most and which category your favorite protagonist falls into. Remember, it's rare for anyone to be one singular thing, and most protagonists will fall into different categories throughout different points in their story. However, I do hope that this video helped you think about the lead characters of your shows in a little bit of a different light. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, stay excellent.